Let's do another example of calculating a complete Banzhaf power distribution. And let's look at this. Let's look at group activity number 2. Again, try it on your own first, and you can use this as a way of checking. I'm going to do this a little bit faster just to save time. So first step, identify all the winning coalitions, and it says hint there are 7. So probably on an exam, this is not a hint I would give you, but sometimes, for working on it, it's helpful to know how many we're looking for. That way, if we're short one, um, we can, you know, at least we know it and we can look a little bit harder. But of course, I would start with the Grand Coalition, move on to 3-player coalitions, 18, 9, and 5, 18, 9, and 3, 18, 5, and 3. So I kind of think about removing player 1, removing player 2, removing player 3, and removing player 4. If I do remove player 1, it would not be a winning coalition. We would come up short because that would only be 17. So not all the 3-player coalitions are winning in this particular case. Now moving on to 2-player groups, it looks to me as though any group with 18 will be winning, and any group without 18 will not be winning. So, and that's 7, so hopefully that is all of them. Now we need to find each voter's critical count, so we need to run through and figure out the critical players. Now in the smaller groups, they're all critical because no one player can win by themselves. And notice this also, in like any player who has at least one critical count has power. Because when we're doing the final calculation, they have at least one count to their name, so they're going to have some influence at the end of the day. Everybody has a little bit of importance, which is good. Looking at the larger coalitions, 18 is important to each of these, but individually, neither of those other 2 players are critical because if we remove either 9 or 5, it's not going to matter because 18 plus either 9 or 5, or 5 or 3, or 9 or 3, will win. So in this case, each of the 3-player coalitions, only 18 is critical. And in the Grand Coalition, 18 is also critical because 9, 5, and 3 was not winning without 18. So doing the complete counts here, 18 was critical 7 times. Players 2, 3, and 4 with votes 9, 5, and 3 respectively were each only critical once, which leaves us with a total of 10. A Banzhaf power distribution as 7/10, 1/10, 1/10, and 1/10, which would leave us with a percentage of 70, 10, and 10. So this was a little bit easier on the fraction side to do, but at the end of the day, finding the critical players can still be tricky, and that's really usually the main thing that gets my students messed up in my experience. So just be careful to find them all. Be careful with determining the criticality, and it does take a little bit of practice. The final couple questions are just, these are questions I like to ask on my exams. I like to have you do the math and then kind of ask your opinion or ask you to go into what you think about the answer. And that just kind of helps me see how well you're understanding the problem and what our answer implies. But it asks, do we see any issues with the calculated distribution of power in this business venture? And actually, if we go back and look at this, player 1 actually has veto power because they were critical in the Grand Coalition. And really all that's saying is that without 18, the other 3 players cannot win even combined. And if we add them all up, that would be... Remember, one of the tricks I taught you for veto power is if you add everyone else up, if their net weight is less than the quota, that other player will have veto power. So in this case, it's 12-17, short of the quota. Hence, player 1 has veto power. But another way to tell from the Banzhaf power distribution is if the player is critical in literally every coalition, that means they have veto power as well. Because what I can kind of conclude from looking at this list here is that 18 is needed to win, right? The only way it will win is if 18 says yes, because in every possible coalition, 18 is there. And that's another way you can identify veto power. So basically, P1 has veto power. And cool. And the question that number 6 asks, is there an issue? Well, perhaps that could be an issue, right? Like maybe we might not want player one to have so much power because veto power is a pretty strong position to be in. If you don't want something to happen, it's not going to happen. It might be wise to make sure the other three players have at least enough votes to make the quota. So if it is 3-1, maybe not. And another issue that is present is that, well, if we're looking at players 2 through 4 with 9, 5, and 3 votes, they all actually had equal power in the Banzhaf power distribution. Which again, the question is this really an issue or not? But you could argue that it's kind of unfair to player 2 because they have 3 times as many votes, so they might have like if this was a company where they paid money for these shares, uh, player 2 may have paid 3 times more money, but still doesn't really get him anywhere. And we can use this math, like the way this math could be useful in the real world is to know, well, if I'm trying to invest in a company and I want to have some say, if I'm buying extra shares, is this meaningful in any way? And if we didn't really analyze it, right, we might not know. And so we'd say, well, sure, buy another share. But if we didn't really think about it, it might be a waste of money strictly from the power decision side of things. Now, if you're buying shares as an investment to try to gain value, that's a whole different story. But I think you see what I mean in terms of the balance of power distribution helping to see how influential each person is. And the last question is if the quota were changed to a simple majority, would it change the balance of power? So in this case, we to find a simple majority, let's go ahead and do that. So we need to add up all of the votes, 18, 9, 5, and 3. If we divide that by 2, we would have 17.5. So in that case, the quota, if it was a simple majority, sorry, 1 second, would be 18 because we take half the total votes and round up. And notice that it would change the coalitions because if it were changed to 18, so yes, it would change the balance of power because notice that some of these coalitions, well, actually all of these would still be winning coalitions, but one of the major issues if the quota were set to be 18, so we could kind of write this out like this, is that player one would be a dictator here because player one by themselves could now pass the quota, and the other three players still couldn't do anything. So this would be a much larger problem, and that's why a simple majority quota doesn't always work, and why you have to really analyze it. Because again, having a dictator completely defeats the entire purpose of why we're having a weighted voting system. And in a situation like this is maybe not perfect, but sometimes there is no perfect way around the issues in a weighted voting system. And now when you have a lot more players, it gets a little bit easier to balance the distribution of power in a more fair way. Like with the European Union, we could see the Banzhaf power was very close to that of the votes themselves, which you could argue is a lot, which seems pretty fair. And when with nations, they spend a lot of time and energy thinking about this, and that's one of the main reasons why the Electoral College, each state is weighted the way it is. Even though in Chapter 4 we're going to kind of talk about some of the issues with the Electoral College in terms of a fairness issue between the citizens. But anyways, that will wrap up the bonds of power distribution. Next week, we will start on the Shapley-Shubik power distribution. Has a lot of similar elements with a couple key differences, which we'll focus on, and again, kind of run through some practice, and then try to wrap it up. Anyways, hope you all have a nice weekend. Try to work on up to 2.2, and that should kind of get you caught up for the end of week 1. And in week 2, we will finish chapter 2, work through chapter 4, and our first exam will be on Friday.